I spent years paying my sister's bills while her unemployed husband sat around making excuses. But when I finally said no, she called me selfish. For 5 years, I was my sister's personal ATM. Every time she needed something, bills, groceries, clothes for the kids, she called me. And like an idiot, I always helped. I thought I was being a good brother. I thought I was doing the right thing. But in reality, I was just a convenient bank account with a pulse. Sarah and Jake were always struggling. Jake was between jobs for as long as I could remember. He had big dreams, of course. Some vague nonsense about starting a business, investing, making it big. Meanwhile, he spent most of his time drinking beer and playing online poker. Sarah, my older sister, would call me crying about how they were behind on rent, how the kids needed shoes, how the car was breaking down. And every time I pulled out my wallet, it started small. $100 here, a couple hundred there. But then it became thousands. I was covering their rent for months at a time, paying off their credit cards, even buying Christmas presents for their kids when they couldn't afford to. And it wasn't like I was rich. I worked 60-hour weeks just to stay ahead. But I told myself family comes first. That's what Mom always said, right? Family helps family. It took me way too long to realize the pattern. They weren't just struggling. They were using me. Sarah never even pretended it was a loan. She never mentioned paying me back. And Jake, he didn't even thank me. Half the time, he acted like I owed him, like it was my job to make sure their bills got paid. It was exhausting, but I convinced myself it was temporary, that someday Jake would get his act together and they wouldn't need me anymore. Then I met Emily. We met at a work event. She was sharp, funny, and had this way of cutting through nonsense. We started dating, and within months, she noticed something I hadn't even admitted to myself. "Why are you always broke?" She asked one night when I told her I couldn't afford a weekend trip. "You work like crazy, and you don't spend money on yourself. Where does it go?" That was the moment everything clicked. I wasn't living my own life. I was living Sarah's. My paycheck didn't belong to me. It belonged to them, and I'd let it happen. I wasn't obligated to keep doing this. I didn't owe them my paycheck, my time, or my sanity. I had a choice, and this time, I was finally choosing myself. I exhaled slowly. No more excuses. No more guilt. No more playing the role of their personal ATM. This wasn't something I could back out of now. I needed to see Sarah face to face, lay it out plain and simple. No more money, not a cent, not ever again. Tomorrow, I'd show up at her door, look her dead in the eye, and tell her, this stops now. I pulled up in front of Sarah and Jake's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I wanted to admit. I had spent years walking into this house as their savior, their problem solver. Today, I was walking in as something else, someone who was done. Sarah opened the door, saw me, and her expression shifted instantly. Relief, followed by expectation. She must have thought I was here with another check, another financial lifeline. But the second she saw my face, she hesitated. I wasn't here to save them. I was here to save myself. I stepped inside, my stomach tight. The house smelled like stale beer and takeout. Same as always. Jake was on the couch, half watching a football game, a bottle in hand. When he noticed me, he barely moved. I told them, no more money, no more covering rent bills or whatever crisis they'd cooked up this time. Sarah's reaction was immediate, like I'd slapped her across the face. Her voice hit that high-pitched, panicked tone I knew too well. She didn't beg. She attacked. I was selfish. I was abandoning my own family. I had let some woman, meaning Emily, turn me against them. Jake, on the other hand, stayed quiet for a second, just staring at me. Then he laughed, low and mean, said I wasn't serious, that family takes care of family, that I'd be back the second things got bad again, because I always came back. He wasn't pleading. He was demanding. Something inside me snapped. I laughed too, not out of humor, out of sheer disbelief. This guy, this unemployed, beer-drinking gambler, had the audacity to act like I owed him, like I had some kind of duty to keep funding his bad choices. I told him the truth. I wasn't his safety net anymore. He could figure it out, just like I had all these years. And since we were on the topic of money, I let them know something else. The car they had been driving wasn't even theirs. I had bought it for Sarah when their old one broke down, and since I was the one who paid for it, the title was in my name. I was selling it. Jake shot up from the couch, the bottle dropping from his hand. His face turned red. He charged toward me, fists clenched, ready to swing. But I didn't flinch. I just stood there, staring him down. I didn't need to fight. I had already won. Sarah screamed at him to stop, but he was too far gone. I let him get close enough to see that I wasn't scared of him. Then I stepped back and shook my head, told him one last thing before I walked out that door. Maybe it's time you figure out how to be a man without my wallet. I thought that was the end of it. I was so wrong. 2 days later, my parents invited me to dinner. The moment I walked in, I knew. It was an ambush. Sarah and Jake were already sitting at the table, their expressions a mix of smug confidence and forced sympathy. My mom gave me that nervous smile she always did when she was trying to keep the peace, and my dad sat stiffly, arms crossed, saying nothing. Sarah started first. Her voice was softer than usual, calculated. She wasn't yelling this time. She was pleading, talking about how I was abandoning her kids, how they'd suffer without my help. She played every emotional card she had, and when that didn't work, Jake jumped in. He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide like he was the victim in all of this. Said I had plenty of money, that I was just being selfish. I let them talk. I let them throw everything they had at me. I watched as Sarah wiped at her fake tears, as Jake leaned back like he had all the power in the world. They had done this so many times before, twisting the narrative, making me out to be the bad guy. But this time, I wasn't playing along. Then I leaned forward and laid out the truth. 60-hour weeks, no vacations, no savings, no luxury lifestyle, just me, grinding every day to keep my head above water while they sat back and took. I had no life of my own, because I was too busy making sure they had won. Silence. Sarah's face twitched, like she was scrambling for another angle, another way to manipulate the situation. Jake's jaw clenched, his bravado cracking just a little. For the first time, neither of them had anything to say. I could feel my mother shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Then my father, the man who had spent years turning a blind eye to Sarah's behavior, finally spoke. My dad let out a long breath, his expression hardening. Enough. This has gone on long enough. Sarah's mouth opened, then shut. Jake scoffed, shaking his head, muttering something under his breath. But my father wasn't done. He looked straight at Sarah, his voice firm in a way I hadn't heard in years. Told her it was time to stand on her own 2 feet, that I wasn't responsible for their failures. My mom sighed, looking down at her hands. Jake slammed his fist on the table, rattling the plates. My mom flinched, but my dad stayed still, watching. It was like he had finally seen Jake for who he really was. His face twisted in rage. "You can't do this to us," he spat. "You think you're better than us? You owe us." He wasn't just angry, he was furious. He pointed at me, saying I was ruining everything, that I couldn't just pull the rug out from under them like this. He demanded I fix this, that I put everything back the way it was. I stayed seated, calm. I reminded him about the car, the one I bought, the one still in my name, and I told him, hand over the keys, now, or I make a call, and that car is gone before you even get home. The room went dead silent. My heart pounded, but I didn't let it show. I kept my eyes locked on Jake, waiting for him to make his next move. He was losing control, and we both knew it. Jake thought he had control. He was wrong. He had no idea what was coming next. The silence stretched, thick with tension. My dad exhaled sharply and leveled his gaze at Sarah and Jake. Then he dropped the bomb. They had been paying the mortgage on Sarah's house for years. Every missed payment, every late notice. Every time she had called them crying, my parents had been covering it. Thousands of dollars. Gone. They hadn't wanted to tell me because they knew I was already carrying too much. But now, they were done. Sarah's face turned white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between my parents, searching for some last-minute mercy, something that would change their minds. But she found none. She looked at Jake, desperate for him to say something that would fix this, to turn things around. But for once, he had nothing. Jake, on the other hand, recovered fast. He leaned forward, sneering, and played his last card. Jake sneered and played his last card, his voice low and threatening. If they cut him and Sarah off, they'd never see their grandkids again. He let the words hang in the air, thinking he had delivered the knockout punch. My mom flinched like she had been slapped, but my dad didn't even blink. He just shook his head and told Jake how it was going to be. If they tried that, the bank would take the house. Because guess what? My parents weren't paying another dime. They had already informed the bank. Sarah and Jake had 60 days to figure it out. Sarah burst into tears, clutching at her mother's sleeve, her voice breaking as she begged them to reconsider. My parents sat unmoved. They had seen this performance too many times before. This time, there was no softening, no reassurance. Just silence. Even my mom, the peacemaker, sat with her lips pressed together, hands folded in her lap. Jake shifted uncomfortably, drumming his fingers on the table. He looked at Sarah, then at my dad, searching for some sign of weakness. But he found none. The walls were closing in and he knew it. His bravado cracked. He started talking fast, backtracking, acting like this was all just a misunderstanding. But nobody was buying it. Then my dad did something that stopped the entire room. He reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, pulled out a check, and slid it across the table. The air in the room shifted. This was the final nail in the coffin. The room went dead silent as everyone stared at the small slip of paper that now held their fate. $10,000. One final act of generosity. Take it. Start over. But this was it. No more safety nets. No more bailouts. This was the last time. Jake scoffed, letting out a dry laugh, shaking his head like all of this was beneath him. He crossed his arms, glancing at Sarah as if waiting for her to back him up, but she was frozen, still staring at the check like it might disappear if she blinked. His fingers twitched when he glanced at the check. He wanted it, needed it. His pride wouldn't let him admit it. As they stood up to leave, I caught it, the briefest flicker of something in his eyes. Fear. This was the end of the road. The free ride was over. For the first time in his life, he had no backup plan, no quick fix, no one left to bail him out. And that fear in his eyes? It was real. Months passed. No more begging calls. No more manipulation. The silence was strange at first, almost unsettling. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did. And then one day Sarah called. For the first time in years, she didn't ask for money. No guilt-tripping, no excuses. Her voice was different, calm, almost hesitant. Like she didn't know how to talk to me without a financial angle. She apologized. Not just a quick, empty sorry, but a real, measured apology. She admitted she had taken advantage of me, of our parents. Said she had spent months sitting in that tiny apartment, staring at the walls, realizing there was no backup plan left. She wanted to fix things. Not with money, just with time. She didn't promise miracles, just a willingness to change. It caught me off guard. The Sarah I knew would have never admitted fault. But people change, or at least some try to. She told me Jake had finally gotten a job. Nothing fancy, just a warehouse gig, but he was showing up every day. For the first time, he was earning instead of scheming. No poker, no shortcuts. Just a job, a paycheck, and the simple truth. This was life now, and no one was coming to bail them out. She didn't make excuses for him. Didn't try to paint it as some grand transformation. Just stated the facts. They had downsized, moved to a smaller apartment, started fresh. And for the first time, they were standing on their own. Our parents, they were thriving. Not just surviving, but finally, after decades of being caregivers, being free. No more midnight calls about unpaid bills. No more stress over bailing someone out. They went to Italy, hiked through Colorado, and Mom even mentioned skydiving. Something she would have never considered before. They had embraced life fully. And now, they were now planning their next adventure. Mom sent pictures. Hiking, smiling, lighter than ever, like the weight of years had finally lifted. As for me, I was finally free. Not just financially, but mentally. No more weight on my shoulders. No more guilt every time my phone rang. I had spent years taking care of everyone else, and now, for the first time, I was taking care of myself. I was building something for myself now. Something real. My business was thriving. I had taken up boxing again, and Emily and I were planning for the future. Moving in, maybe even marriage. For the first time, my money, my time, my life, it was mine to shape. Family is messy. People screw up, use each other, make selfish choices. But sometimes they change, and sometimes they don't. The difference is, I finally stopped waiting for them to be different. I chose myself, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living.
Bye-bye.